Finally, the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire has begun. But will there ever be peace? It's a desperately needed pause in fighting as prisoners are sent home. But in Gaza, few now have homes to return to. While Israel reserves the right to relaunch its assault at any time, and settlers look to retake parts of Gaza and the West Bank. Are we actually seeing a progression toward peace, or just a break in an indefinite conflict? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the Gaza ceasefire. Vital humanitarian supplies are finally pouring into Gaza, as many in the enclave are returning to find countless neighborhoods in ruins. Some can't even identify where their homes used to stand, as every landmark has been destroyed. Despite that, though, there is a sense of relief in Gaza. In this first phase of a long-awaited ceasefire agreement, Palestinians should see at least 42 days without Israeli attacks. But with phase 2 and 3 of the deal still to be agreed, it's unclear whether peace will prevail. Here's a look.
Relief, tears, and worries in Gaza. The ceasefire, which ends Israel's 471-day war, came into effect on Sunday. It's the first phase of 3 that in the next 6 weeks will see the release of 33 hostages captured by Hamas in exchange for 2,000 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, many without charge. Israeli forces will withdraw from the cities to a buffer zone along the Gaza border, allowing displaced Palestinians to return to their homes. There will also be a surge of desperately needed aid into the Strip. In the second stage, Hamas will free all the remaining captives who are alive in return for more Palestinian prisoners. And Israel will completely withdraw its forces from Gaza. The final phase includes an ambitious 3 to 5 year reconstruction plan for Gaza, and the remains of hostages who have been killed will be returned to their families. But the negotiations to finalize the second and third phases will continue during the 6 weeks of phase 1. For now, Gazans have begun returning to their homes in the north, but only finding rubble.
I built this house piece by piece. And when I returned, I didn't find it as I knew it. All I see is devastation and ruin. I don't see my home. I only see destruction.
In the occupied West Bank, thousands have greeted the first Palestinians released from Israeli detention.
I left hell and now I am in heaven. We are out of hell. They used to violate us, beat us, fire tear gas toward us. They used to count us while our heads were down on the floor. Suddenly, they would enter the cells and fire tear gas toward us. They say bad words at us. There is no food, no sweets, no salt. There is nothing.
And there were similar scenes in Israel as 3 hostages were freed by Hamas. Thousands gathered in what's become known as Hostages Square in Tel Aviv as families reunited with their loved ones. Back in Gaza, the humanitarian aid is beginning to flood in. Around 600 trucks per day are now able to enter. While the aid is bringing relief to Palestinians, there are growing questions over how the deal will progress. Some in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet are deeply unhappy.
Unfortunately, we were not able to stop this dangerous deal, but insisted, and we were able to assure, through government decision, the cabinet, and other ways to assure that the war will not stop without fulfilling all its goals, and the complete destruction of Hamas in Gaza.
While the deal was brokered with US President Joe Biden at the helm, President Donald Trump was quick to claim credit for the agreement. His Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, was at the negotiating table before Trump officially takes office. On Saturday, Trump said if Hamas respects the deal, it will hold. But if not, all hell will break out. Palestinians are celebrating the halt to seemingly never-ending death and destruction, but their future is still on a knife edge.
So will this ceasefire prove a temporary respite or a firm step on the path toward peace? Well, joining me now to debate that and much more are from Maryland, Palestinian author and journalist Laila el-Haddad. From London, former head of communications for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, Gunness. And also from London, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and former advisor to the Israeli government, Daniel Levy. Thanks all so much for being with me. Laila, I have to start with you and first tell us, as a Gazan yourself, what this has meant to your friends and family and contacts that are still there to at least have the bombing stopped.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, enormous relief. There's no real words to describe the hell that they've been to and back. And I think uncertainty, but for just a brief moment, enormous relief and joy. And as I like to remind people, that is so important. Being able to feel and to express that joy and hope are so incredibly important in whether you want to consider it a liberation struggle or a struggle against genocide and erasure. That, I think, is their mandate. That's what keeps them going. Of course, many of them, my family members are scattered throughout both the north and central Gaza, and some in whatever remains of the south. And many simply don't have anything to go back to, unfortunately. Many are looking forward to being able to go back to the remnants of their homes and dig through the rubble and find the remains of their family members, my aunts, my cousins, and be able to bury them. But at least for the moment, just immense joy and relief.
Right. So, Chris, I mean, you're hearing the elation in the immediate implementation of this agreement. But like we said, thousands of people are trying to return to homes that no longer actually exist. So what needs to happen on the humanitarian front now that workers have this sort of safety guarantee?
Put simply, Gaza has to be flooded with humanitarian aid and equipment. So the crossings, and I mean all of them, have to be open 24/7 so that water and food and medicine, sanitation products, sanitary products for women, and equipment, because don't forget, although people are returning to their homes, not only are these homes bombed out, some of them destroyed. I mean, between 80 and 90% of the housing stock in Gaza is either damaged or destroyed. But people are returning to homes where their relatives are decomposed and rotting, are dismembered, where there are corpses of loved ones. I mean, this is not just a question of returning to a bombed-out home and trying to eke out a living. There is deep, deep grief for relatives who, for months, have, in some cases, perhaps less time, so the grief is even more raw. There'll be relatives buried underneath the rubble, and those body parts have got to be found. In order to do that, as I say, we've got to get in massive amounts of humanitarian aid and humanitarian equipment, and there's only one organization that is able to do that, has the footprint, the trucks, the warehouses, etc., and that's UNRWA, which of course is problematic because the Israeli Knesset has passed in the end of October 2 bills declaring, telling Israelis that there must be no cooperation with UNRWA and that UNRWA effectively is an illegal organization.
Right. I mean, there was a 90-day reprieve after that October decision, but that expires in, 10 days? So what's supposed to happen?
I mean, well, that's a very good question. I wouldn't necessarily call it a reprieve. The Knesset legislation basically says that there's 90 days before it comes into effect. But in the meantime, Kogat, the part of the Israeli army that effectively enforces the illegal collective punishment of Gaza, the bit that UNRWA has to work with to get aid in, they've effectively cut off any cooperation with UNRWA. They have instead been coordinating trucks going in with the World Food Programme, with UNICEF, and with the WHO, the World Health Organization. So what looks like is going to happen is that the one organization that has the warehouses, that has the food distribution centers, that has the trucks, and don't forget that there are over 4,000 trucks waiting to get into Gaza. 2/3 of those actually belong to UNRWA. I mean, nothing illustrates the sheer vital necessity of UNRWA's life-saving infrastructure more than that simple fact. So when you say, what might happen, we don't know. And by the way, that's just Gaza. We also need to talk at some stage in this program about the West Bank, which looks increasingly as if Israel will move forward with plans to annex it. And already UNRWA facilities and UNRWA staff are under attack in the West Bank. And it looks as if the same playbook that's been used against UNRWA in Gaza may well be used against UNRWA in the West Bank. Though, as I say, it's not certain yet. The time, unfortunately, will tell.
Right. I mean, you just described a huge part of the reason why people aren't that confident the ceasefire will be able to deliver too much in the long term. But Daniel, let me ask you, just, hearing the complications that Chris was describing there, how smoothly are you expecting this implementation to go?
About as smooth as a ride on the bumpiest road you can imagine, so not smoothly at all. If I may, what Chris just said is so important, because you cannot be serious about fulfilling a core component of the deal which has just been entered into, which is the necessary massive scaling up of humanitarian assistance. Let's just also note that the denial of that assistance is a war crime. That is one of the reasons Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Secretary Gallant of Israel have International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued against them. You cannot allow that provision of humanitarian assistance while being at war with UNRWA, or in the case of the US, Sweden and others, while cutting the funding of UNRWA. So that is just one of many of these bumps in the road. The primary reason we should be so concerned is that we've had a moment of really unusual clarity. You normally don't get this. Normally one looks at things and says, wow, it's really complex. Can you help me unpack this? There's nothing complex at a moment when the Israeli coalition, parts of that coalition tell you, we have been preventing a deal. We will bring down the government if the government does not resume war. One party has left with that as its condition for rejoining Ben-Gvir's Jewish power. Another party has stayed in for now, but has said it will not stay in indefinitely unless the war is resumed. That's Bezalel Smotrich's religious Zionism. So the kind of, all the curtains have been pulled back.
Yeah.
And there's the Wizard of Oz, Benjamin Netanyahu, in his nakedness. And we can see transparently, he blocked the deal for ideological as well as political reasons, but he blocked the deal. He will try and prevent seeing through its fullness, in other words, all phases, end of war, withdrawal of the Israeli troops. And it's really interesting that he has offered us no narrative whatsoever of post-war. He has offered us the continuation of war.
Because, I mean, Daniel, this is basically the same deal that was actually agreed back in May, but was never implemented. So, I mean, what are you saying that's actually changed between May and now? Is that what Netanyahu had to give the basic minimum? Before Trump actually took office, given his threats in particular?
Well, precisely. And let's just pause, because it's emotional. And we heard Laila. And it's remarkable to see the resilience of the Palestinian people in Gaza. It was, and people who may not be familiar with this, the extent to which there's this identification with the Israelis being held in Gaza. So it was an emotional day in Israel to see the 3 women released. But let's hold in our hearts for a moment the tens of thousands. Look at those images. The tens of thousands of people who've been killed in Gaza. This should never have been allowed to happen. That deal was on the table. And what has changed? And I would draw this one distinction. I think exactly what has changed is that until now, Netanyahu had a domestic calculation without any real external challenge to weigh up versus that domestic calculation. Why? Because the Biden administration lied to us, and they refused to use any leverage, and they in fact ran cover for Netanyahu. And we see now how easily he can be made nervous. But I want to be very clear on something. Netanyahu is fearful of the potential of a fallout with Trump for his personal politics. We should not confuse that with any kind of notion that Trump or the Republican Party are a friend of peace, Palestinian rights, of ending occupation and apartheid. That, of course, would be pure silliness.
Chris, quickly, I saw you had a comment.
Just very quickly, building on what Daniel said, we now have this extraordinary irony that in order to bring the hostages home and for the deal really to take hold, the services of UNRWA are now essential. So UNRWA is now part of the process of bringing the hostages home to Israel, because, you know, and as I say, unless the Gaza Strip is flooded with aid, there's every chance that along this bumpy road that Daniel describes, a single incident, a single person could spark something which would bring the whole thing down. And the other point to make, excuse me, very briefly, is that when we move forward with the next phases, there are 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza, and 10% of the ordnance that has gone in, this was the case when I was there in 2014 working for UNRWA, 10% of the ordnance is unexploded. Now, imagine what that means. In 2014, the United Nations Mine Action Service had to come in, and as the rubble was cleared, they had to defuse all this unexploded ordnance. That cannot happen without UNRWA's engineering department and without all the vehicles that UNRWA has. So we have this extraordinary irony that in order for this deal to happen, which the Israelis so desperately want, is UNRWA, an organization that's just been declared legal effective by UNRWA, is absolutely inimical to the success of the plan.
Right. Laila, let me come back to you. I mean, you described, of course, the elation that people are feeling just being able to not hear the bombs falling, return to their homes or what's left of them, seeing their families again. But now, soon enough, the reality will have to set in. And as Chris mentioned before, we're also keeping an eye on what Israel is doing in the West Bank and what can still go very wrong in Gaza. So what do you see over the next 42 days while at least phase one of this peace deal is supposed to be complete?
I think that there are more questions than there are answers, unfortunately. And you're right. I think that Palestinians in Gaza are under no illusions about what this may or may not mean. They understand very clearly. I mean, these are people who have endured 17 years of punishing Israeli sanctions and siege, and obviously decades more of occupation. And I dare say that's, you know, in my perspective, one of the reasons, in addition, of course, to wanting to completely erase and starve the Palestinians there, why they are targeting UNRWA, is because they understand that they have kept the Palestinian, you know, the identity, especially of the refugees, the idea of the right of return, their connectedness to the land alive. And you know, my own husband is a product of UNRWA refugee camps in Lebanon, and he's now a world-renowned surgeon. This is what UNRWA produces, and this is what the Israelis are afraid of. But going back to the next 42 days, I think, yeah, they're under no illusions about what this means. And I think in speaking to them, they understand that what lies ahead is immense, and there's simply no ability to rebuild. As Chris mentioned, not only the immense amount of rubble, but the infrastructure, that, you know, there's no universities. You know, speaking to students, I think this is a very important point. 75% of the population are under the age of 25, right? So they're either in primary school or high school or college, and every single university has been destroyed, and the schools are all being used as shelter. So what future does one go back to? You know, I think it's for now wait and see, but I think it's incumbent upon everyone to continue to exert pressure, and one hopes, one has no expectations, obviously, from the Trump administration, but that is the hope, that there is continued pressure. I think not necessarily from centers of power, but from my perspective, you know, as a Palestinian and as an advocate and someone who's been involved in organizing, from those on the outside of the centers of power.
Right. And Daniel, you know, if we're looking at the people that are influencing, if not deciding, how this peace process or ceasefire moves forward and how Israel behaves. We now have, under the new Trump administration taking power, Steve Witkoff. He's a real estate mogul, basically. He's now the U.S. envoy to the region. I mean, how much do you trust these people to actually work in the benefit of both parties, because they hold, especially the fate of phase 2 and phase 3, really in their hands?
Yeah, it shouldn't be a question of that trust, because that would be misplaced. There's no reason to go down the path of assuming that. What I think we have to pay attention to is, first of all, it's not just that such a significant cohort of the Israeli body politic, its media echo chamber, want to resume the attacks and this destruction of Gaza. They want to finish that Nakba. They want to make Gaza permanently uninhabitable, to depopulate Gaza, to resettle the north of Gaza. One should take at face value what the Israeli leadership have been telling us all along, from the president to the ministers to others, in terms of drawing no distinction between combatant and civilian. And I don't expect a new administration to handle that in a fundamentally different way. But, and the but here is significant. First of all, as people who are not part of that inner circle, we have to take upon ourselves the understanding that nobody operates in a vacuum, not the Israeli government and not the Trump administration. And everybody has the ability to impact in whatever small, growing into large ways, the environment, the context in which people operate, whether that's the significant measures that have been taken by important global South countries, or whether that's the civil society measures, the sanctions, the boycotts, the pressures, the protests. Everyone operates in that kind of an environment. If we can get to a critical mass, I don't want to paint Pollyannish pictures here, but it can place some influence, some restrictions on what is done. And secondly, and this is partly why Netanyahu never wanted to be in this moment, there is an unpredictability now once you're in an agreement. Don't underestimate, and I think Hamas was fully aware this would be the case, don't underestimate the kind of internal debate that has been set off inside Israel by seeing those 3 women released yesterday. Again, I'll draw a distinction. It's not that people are suddenly paying attention to or caring about Palestinian lives, the loss of those lives, the destruction. But they are questioning. They can see the images we see. They see that Hamas is in control in Gaza. They see what's going on, and they know at some visceral level, many of them, that this has failed. And so it's a real debate inside Israel. One can either play to Israel's worst instincts, or it can challenge and hold accountable and make the Israeli public and their leaders ultimately think again. And that's the challenge for everyone in this next period.
Let me ask Laila if you have any confidence that what Daniel just described there will actually play out, because there are others who say no matter how there might be an ICC warrant out for Netanyahu, the world may have exposed, war crimes, everything else, it doesn't matter, because what has happened in Gaza has given Israel the means to forward Netanyahu's right-wing agenda, and that Gaza will eventually be emptied out. Because from the outside, if you look at those who support Netanyahu, they think he's kind of brought down, he's disarmed Hezbollah, he's brought down Iran in a sense. So ultimately all this is working. So where does that leave you in Gaza?
It's funny because I've had these conversations in my head, and I think many of us in the Palestinian, specifically Gazan community, have. And I think it's a matter of sort of narratives, right? You see on one hand, and of calculus, like what's the equation we're using to understand, I don't want to use the word victory, but maybe success or something. And on one hand, you have obviously tens of thousands, if not more, I'm hearing the numbers, 100,000 Palestinians who have been killed and many more maimed. I was just speaking with, the heads of some organizations that were over-discussing, trying to evacuate medvac people who they're not able to, they're waiting for a ceasefire deal and so on, and visiting with others who've been amputated here in Baltimore. And just the scale of that, when I think of it, it's very overwhelming. So, on one hand, it feels like that. There's these moments of just utter demoralization. I think that we as Palestinians, and I think this is normal at moments over the past 15 months, have felt like it's sort of us against the world, and just this unlimited supply of state-of-the-art weaponry and money, and no matter what we did, that just kept flowing freely towards Israel. And on the other, and I think of, there's a really wonderful little whatever you call it, a graphic or something, a meme, I guess my husband sent me, that said, the greatest ceasefire in the world was between Gaza and the world, and how small is the world and how big is Gaza. The point being, and I think this is despite the devastation, destruction, there's an immense feeling, I don't want to use the word pride, but that despite this all, we managed to remain steadfast and exist. And there's something incredibly powerful about that.
Yeah.
If you even forget about Hamas being in control for a second and all of that, just the fact that the people have managed to resist erasure in its sort of most grotesque form, and with unlimited financial backing and diplomatic cover and arms, a plan that was very clearly laid out, and that the fact that they managed to resist that is a huge, I think, success for them. Indeed. And so there is this sort of tension when it comes to the narratives. And is there anything we can do? But at the same time, we've been standing for all these decades, and that no matter what I think Israel does, you cannot defeat this idea. Not necessarily of Hamas, but the idea of this thirst for liberation and freedom, whether it comes in the form of Hamas or in another form.
Okay. Chris, I'm sorry, I can't give you a final word. We are actually over time for this edition of the program. I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.